Hi,
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm just gonna keep admitting students as they're coming in here.
Okay.
Welcome, everybody. How's everything going in Nebraska?
It's good. Yep, it's finally starting to cool down. It's been so hot all summer through now, so I feel like we're finally getting into fall.
Yeah, that's how it is in Southeast Georgia right now. It's the last week's been really kind of nice in the 80s and a nice little break.
Nice. Yeah. I know I'll be regretting saying I want it to get cold by December when it's negative 30 degrees here, but
Yeah, those Midwest states, they really get it.
yep.
Where are you originally from?
Ohio.
Ohio, okay.
Yeah. Where are you from?
Rochester, New York.
Oh, okay.
Not too
So
far. Yeah, so
you're
used to
no
the
stranger
cold.
to the cold. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It was a little bit of an adjustment coming here, and it's the summers can be pretty hot and humid.
Hmm.
All right. I think almost everybody is here. Give it another minute. Are you okay with recording this? Just in case
Oh,
anyone
yeah.
is
Hmm.
absent. This isn't.
Hmm.
And so, like always, everybody, if you have any questions as we're going along, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question along the way. So that's all open up for you as well. So I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Leah Butler. She's an assistant professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at University of Nebraska, Omaha. And a lot of her research, as you know, as I posted some articles up in Folio. So if you haven't had a chance to read those or go through, make sure you go into the guest presenter materials that I have in Folio with some of the articles there. A lot of Dr. Butler's research focuses in on sexual victimization and intimate partner violence, as well as corrections with an emphasis on race and racial attitudes and public opinion of correctional policy. And we'll talk a little bit about her article that constructs a mechanism, a tool of looking at intimate partner violence online. So this is a really new area of research that still needs a lot of work to kind of get us where we need to be. And Dr. Butler's work is certainly, pushing us forward in that way. So would you mind just kind of starting off talking a little bit about you and how you got involved with this type of work?
Sure. Yeah. So my interest in victimization came really early on in my career. So I worked at a domestic violence shelter when I was an undergrad and through my master's and PhD program. And throughout my earliest research projects were looking at bystander intervention among college students as a way of preventing sexual and dating violence among college students. I'm sorry if there's background noise. There's nonstop construction on the street right outside my house. So hopefully you can hear me okay.
That sounds pretty good. Yeah, it's always
Okay.
when you're trying to do one of these things that you get the notes.
Yep. So yeah, and then so I've always had an interest in especially intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and the intimate partner cyber abuse research that I've started working on just in the past 3 years or so came from myself and one of my fellow graduate students at the time at the University of Cincinnati, standing outside of Bonnie Fisher's door waiting. She had double booked meetings with both of us, and we were both waiting for another appointment to finish. And we just started talking about cyber victimization. Dr. Fissel is a professor at University of Central Florida, and she and I talked about cyber stalking, and I talked about my interest in intimate partner violence, and we realized there's an overlap here that cyberstalking occurs within intimate relationships, and that often these behaviors, at least sort of what we witnessed anecdotally just from friends and people we know, is that these behaviors are kind of normalized. And so that led us to actually meet together with Dr. Fisher and talk about how we might measure these behaviors and how to look at people's attitudes toward these behaviors that might be allowing them to continue.
Yeah, I always found that interesting. And some of the other people we talked to mentioned similar things where it's kind of fortuitous, right? You kind of stumble into talking with somebody or, meeting with somebody at a conference, and then you keep up with that person. So there's a lot of opportunities that kind of come along the way if you keep your eyes open and talk to people. And so that's sort of a common theme that goes through. And I always tell the students that you never really know when, a really good relationship or project's going to come along if you just kind of are open to it and kind of follow through. A lot of good things can come from that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You never know when that great idea might spark from some conversation that you happen into.
And kind of talking a little bit about the college studies that you've done on intimate partner violence. What are some of the major findings of those studies, and what are you looking to expand in the future in terms of what you look at there?
Sure. So I've done a few related to intimate partner violence and sexual violence. The earliest ones were on bystander intervention. So those were asking people about their behaviors as bystanders if they witnessed, a couple having a fight while they were at a party, or they witnessed someone leading a drunk person off to a isolated place at a bar or a party. Kind of these signs where a sexual victimization or active dating violence might happen, asking people whether they had stepped in those situations. So that early research was looking at kind of the reasons why people do and don't intervene to prevent sexual and dating violence. A lot of it was things like, it's none of my business if a couple is fighting, I don't want to step in and make things worse, or maybe I'm misjudging the situation, or maybe this person is my friend and it seems kind of weird, but I don't really think they would do anything wrong, like abuse their partner or assault someone. So that sort of bleeds into my work now with intimate partner cyber abuse, is looking at how perceptions of abuse influence whether people allow them to happen without doing anything to step in. Then the later research on violence among college students has looked at so one of them was looking at drugging victimization, and the other was looking at repeat sexual assault. And both of these things could happen within intimate relationships. So what we were mainly examining in those two studies was whether people change their lifestyle, routine activity behavior, specifically binge drinking, because we know that binge drinking and the college drinking culture creates risk for all sorts of victimizations. So we wanted to see whether if someone is victimized at one point in time, they reduce their binge drinking to try to mitigate risk at the second point in time. And what we show in both of those studies is that when people do that, they tend to be less likely to have been assaulted or drugged at the second point in time. And then also related to dating violence and sexual violence among college students, I worked on an article with Heejin Lee, who was also at Cincinnati, and Dr. Bonnie Fisher, looking at Title IX in, I think it was 2019, when the DeVos administration, the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, under the Trump administration, changed the rules as far as relating to how colleges regulate and respond to sexual assault and dating violence, any kind of gender-based violence on campus, because of their Title IX obligations. And so that was looking at how sort of the shift in the social construction of violence on campus has influenced policy, and then how there has been kind of this cycle of policy change and backlash and policy change and backlash.
Yeah, one thing that you mentioned that we've talked a lot about. So we read Woman Abuse in Rural Places by Walter de Casaretti, his new book.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in rural communities where we are in Statesboro, I mean, we're a small city, but we're surrounded by a lot of rural areas. And so we've talked a lot about this sort of secrecy around family violence, where it's everywhere, but it's kind of pronounced in some rural areas as well, where this isn't my business and I'm not going to get involved, especially if it's someone I know. And often there's sort of what De Casaretti talks about in terms of male-centered condoning of family violence, where it's not my business, and even if it is, there's something going on there. That's just the man keeping the house in order, and I'm not going to say anything. And this is sort of condoning this type of violence. And so whenever I talk about this in class, one of the things that I mentioned, and as you mentioned, is ways to identify abuse and intimate partner violence, because a lot of times people don't even know that they may be being victimized. This could be stalking behaviors. So in your research and experience, are there some signs, or are there things that especially college-aged individuals can be on the lookout in terms of identifying intimate partner violence when it happens?
Yeah, so a lot of intimate partner violence, regardless of whether it's cyber or stalking or physical, sexual, verbal, centers around maintaining control over your partner. And so kind of the red flags you might notice would be those controlling behaviors or isolating behaviors. Like when we measure intimate partner cyber abuse, our items include things like forces you to block someone on social media so that you can't communicate with them anymore, or tells you what you can and can't post online. We have a financial component that might not apply as much to college students, but it definitely still could. If your partner is monitoring your online spending without your permission or without any legitimate reason to do so. So I think, yeah, recognizing those behaviors that exert control over the partner, are monitoring the partner for reasons that aren't legitimate. Like sometimes you might, like my husband shares his GPS location with me when he goes on long runs, just in case, just for safety. But that's not the same as your partner putting a GPS tracker on your car without your knowledge and making sure that you're at work when you say you're at work. So those behaviors, monitoring, controlling, isolating someone from their family and friends.
Yeah, and that actually lines up perfectly with what we're doing right now. We just started reading a memoir of child abuse called Call Me Tuesday. And this is a young woman that was severely neglected and abused by her mother. And the mother's behavior was very much like that. It was about isolation, isolating from the outside world, but also isolating away from, she had two brothers and a father. So for all the students on the call here, I mean, connect that to what we've been talking about in class of that book, that the mother's behavior was very controlling, always wanted to know where Tuesday was, what she was doing, be right by her side. Sort of also monitoring where she was otherwise and isolating her from her brothers and the father. And that allowed her to be able to do whatever she could do with that individual. So, I mean, again, it's not just something that's inside the home, but it's on campuses and it's among dating partners and live-in partners. So it unfortunately is something that can touch everybody, and to be aware of that.
Absolutely. And another thing to keep in mind is that often the level of control or the level of monitoring or isolating increases over time. So if you start dating someone and after 3 dates you physically assault them, it's a lot easier to then go report you, to break off the relationship immediately, than it is when you've been with someone for months or years and they've kept you from talking to your parents or siblings or friends. You don't have any friends to go to. They don't let you have your own car. You're completely dependent on them financially. That's when it becomes more difficult to leave the relationship, both emotionally and logistically. You might literally not be able to leave. And that's especially true in rural communities.
Yeah, and again, that once again lines up perfectly with what we've been talking about in class of the book. I mean, just last class on Wednesday, I remember we mentioned that often what happens is that abuse becomes more frequent. So it might start with this, something happens, a couple times a month. Then it kind of becomes a couple times a week, and then all of a sudden this abuse and neglect is just an everyday occurrence, and it can really sneak up on victims of this type of abuse, because again, it slowly becomes normative until that part where like, oh wow, it's been years that I've been with this partner, and you're emotionally invested, maybe financially invested, you might have a family, and now the frequency and the severity. Remember that severity can also increase over time, where people can claim this is a one-off kind of a thing, and someone was angry or they were drunk and it'll never happen again, but then all of a sudden it becomes frequent, becomes more severe, and at that point it's much, like we said, much harder to leave for a variety of reasons, and also dangerous to leave those types of.
Right, exactly. I don't know if you're reading the book, or if your students know of the book Dangerous Exits, which kind of goes right along with that the most dangerous point in an abusive relationship is when you leave. And even if a relationship, I think often when people think about intimate partner violence, they think of it becoming really abusive or an actual abusive relationship when physical or sexual violence occurs. But a person has the right to autonomy, freedom of movement, freedom of communication with other people. So even if a partner never physically or sexually assaults their partner, they can still be exerting all the other types of abuse: financial abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse. And that person has the right to not experience those behaviors, to have freedom.
Yeah, and those behaviors are, obviously very detrimental over time too. It's like we tend to think that it's only severe sexual or physical abuse, but any type of emotional abuse, controlling behaviors, manipulation, neglect, I mean, all of those things have severe negative outcomes, and is really important to research as well.
Mm-hmm.
And a really good question from Trey here, a student of mine, who says, with COVID-19 cases, on the rise and having to deal with the pandemic, how do you believe that will affect people that are victimized? Since most individuals don't want to be around other people now, in terms of getting sick, would that isolation, basically help the offender or increase the likelihood of being victimized?
I think so. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm sure that there are people who are still collecting data now that we've seen another surge with the Delta variant and other new variants. But I know that there was research, I want to say Alex Picaro, and I think also my colleagues at UNO, Tara Richards and Justin Nix, conducted research in this area showing that calls for service for domestic violence went up in like spring of 2020, when things completely shut down and people were stuck at home, and in many cases stuck at home with an abusive partner. So I do think that isolation creates more opportunities for abuse to occur, and also makes it more difficult for people who are experiencing abuse to seek help, especially if shelters are overrun, and hospitals are overrun, and police are overrun and understaffed. There are all of these intersecting factors that not only make the abuse more frequent and possibly more severe, but also make the responses to it more sparse.
Yeah, great question, and thanks for talking about that. And we talked to Alex a little bit about this earlier in the semester,
Okay.
and so it's something that we really need to think about, because as society changes and policy changes means that we have to change how we respond and research the issue. So very important there. Kind of getting back to your the development of your intimate partner cyber abuse instrument. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know some of the students in this class, my family violence class, are also in my statistics class. So this is a great article that talks not only about the development of that, but also how you went about sort of using different types of validity and reliability on that. What made you want to work on this study and develop this instrument, and how did you, because you wrote it with one of our professors here, Amanda Graham.
Yep.
And so how did you all get together to do this, to create this instrument, and why did you want to take part in this research?
Yeah, so the development of this instrument took, I want to say, about 2 years, with Dr. Fissel and Dr. Fisher and I working on it. We would meet at this coffee shop. This was pre-COVID. So we would meet at this coffee shop and just agonize over every single item. Is this item capturing what we think it's going to capture? Does the whole scale capture comprehensively all of the different forms of intimate partner cyber abuse that might exist? So if you look at I won't go into a ton of detail about the article if you all have already looked at it, but we really tried to painstakingly make sure that this was a gold standard measure, because really anything you study your results are only as good as the measures you use to yield those results. And looking at the prior research on intimate partner violence using technology or using the internet, there was just not really any consensus. Instruments varied widely, samples varied widely, but with a focus primarily on teenagers and sometimes young adults, but very little attention, or no attention almost, to older adults who also use cell phones and social media. And just, technology is ubiquitous now. It's not a young people thing. Everybody uses technology. And so we wanted to develop an instrument that could be validated for all adults and that captured more comprehensively all of the behaviors that might constitute intimate partner cyber abuse. So we spent a good 2 years coming up with those items. We consulted with experts in the field who looked over the items. They recommended other items, other behaviorally specific items that we might add to our scale. And then we invited Dr. Graham on to help us with the statistical analysis to validate the scale. So she had unique expertise looking at measurement invariance and the different criteria for validity, like convergent, divergent, construct validity. Base validity was something I could manage, but Dr. Graham has more expertise in using the statistical methods that we then used for that article. So it was just kind of a perfect team to come together and validate that scale.
That's awesome. I mean, we need more of that. There in terms of looking at victimization and unfortunately, all the different types of abuse that are somewhat common in these relationships. Whether it be emotional abuse or manipulation, financial manipulation, and of course now intimate partner violence is moving online more and more. That we need specific tools, right, to be able to identify and respond to those. So I mean, that's awesome that this came out. And what do you see as the future use of this tool? Where would you like to see it be integrated? Like, should it be used in schools or universities? Where do you see it being used, and where do you want to go with this in the future?
I think that right now it should be used primarily in research. I mean, I think it would be a great starting point for service providers in schools or universities or in communities to use to develop a screening tool. But because none of us have, like Dr. Fisher, Dr. Fissel, Dr. Graham, and I, none of us are clinicians. So we don't want to say that this should be immediately implemented as a screening tool to figure out whether someone is experiencing abuse or not. I do think it could be a good starting point for that. But I think there's a lot of research potential here. We still have a lot of papers that we want to write just from the data that we've already collected, and we have plans to collect more data. So a few of our future directions, we still haven't presented prevalence rates really for these different dimensions. I mean, in the paper you have the percent experiencing each of the behaviors, but we'd like to present prevalence rates and also present some research or some analysis of risk factors for victimization. Also in that data set, and I know Dr. Fissel is working on a separate project on this as well, but we have measures of perpetration also. But those measures were just asking yes or no, have you done this in the past 6 months? We didn't get a count. So we'd like to gather some kind of higher quality or more detailed data on perpetration as well, and look at risk factors for perpetration. We also are planning on writing a paper on outcomes of intimate partner cyber abuse, specifically health outcomes, things like depression, anxiety, physical illness, other forms of mental illness. And then what's the last one? We're writing the paper on the social construction of intimate partner cyber abuse. That one will probably be the next one that we publish. On how people normalize the behavior. We collected some qualitative data with this survey that we present in the article we've talked about. So we'll have some qualitative research coming out about how people perceive these behaviors. And I think that's it for now, but we have a lot of papers we plan to write on this topic.
Well, it's great. Like we were saying, it's it's a pretty new area of research. So there's a lot that we still need to know. And so definitely glad you're doing that. And so Zion has a question here that earlier you mentioned your research regarding bystander intervention. And he asked, did any results reflect the reasoning for non-intervention as the person doesn't know how to properly and safely intervene? And if so, what would be the best way to de-escalate an abusive situation as a bystander?
That's a great question. So two researchers, John Lutney and I want to say Shirley Darley, in response to the Kitty Genovese case, if any of you are familiar with that, there was a highly publicized murder, and it's since sort of been debunked, the story of it. But at the time, what people believed was that there were dozens of people who watched this murder happen from their apartment buildings and no one stepped in to help. So in the late 70s, these researchers came up with the bystander intervention model. It's a 5-step process, and I think I can remember all 5. So the first is notice the event. The second is decide that the event is intervention appropriate. So it's something that someone needs to intervene on. The third is take responsibility for intervening. The fourth is decide how to intervene. And then the 5th step is actually intervene. So what Zion is getting at is the 4th step, decide how to intervene. And that is one of the, so at each stage, there can be barriers that a person faces so that they don't move on to the next stage. If a person feels like there's a problem here, I should do something, but I just don't know what to do, then they might choose to just do nothing. So there definitely is research to show that that's one of the reasons people don't step in. As far as understanding how to step in, there are a lot of different techniques. There are a lot of programs out there that try to train people on how to intervene successfully. One of the models is the 4 Ds. It's distract, delegate, direct, and I'm forgetting the last one, but essentially it's giving people different options. So a lot of people might think intervention only means you put yourself in the middle of that situation and you have to do something about it. But you can also call on someone else. Maybe if it's say you're out at a bar and you see a couple getting in a fight and you don't know them, figure out who their friends are and go up to their friend and say, hey, can you take your friend away, separate them from this situation? Or you might, maybe it's your friend is highly intoxicated and they're about to get in a fight with someone, or they look like they're about to maybe go home with someone and you're concerned about sexual assault happening, you might say like, hey, I'm really hungry, let's go to Taco Bell, and just distract them from the situation. It doesn't always have to be jumping in and saying what you're doing is wrong and you have to stop right now. You can kind of use those other tactics, distracting them, getting a friend to distract them. Or if it's a really severe situation that presents imminent danger, calling the police is an option, or calling on, like if you're at a bar, calling on the bartender, the doorman to step in, someone with some sort of authority in the situation to step in.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Because yeah, a lot of times it's not that someone doesn't want to, intervene or do something, but they don't know how to. And I mean, a lot of things about individual vulnerability, depending on who you are and your skills or what you feel comfortable with. I mean, a lot of that's going to dictate, as you mentioned, what you do. And so another question here from a student from Matthew is, there's a lot of discussion around sex trafficking in social media on college campuses, like catfishing. Is there any crossover in your research and those types of crime?
I haven't studied sex trafficking on college campuses. That's a really interesting idea, but I have worked with, so one of my colleagues at UNO, Teresa Kulig, studies sex trafficking. That's her main area of research. So she and I have worked together a bit looking at sex trafficking. I think one of the misunderstandings about sex trafficking is that it's like a stranger who's gonna pull up in a black van and pull you into the van and drive you off. Often it's more, the way it happens is more through like a grooming process. And I think that's where social media comes in. You might, someone adds you as a friend on social media and they start talking to you and they start complimenting you and offering you gifts. And then they sort of groom you into engaging in sex work against your will, or coerce you into engaging in sex work when you don't want to. So that's something that I've only just begun to get involved in researching, but actually Dr. Kulig and I applied for a grant that would, if we get it, hopefully would allow us to kind of implement the same process that I did with Dr. Fissel and Dr. Graham and Dr. Fisher, is to develop a measure of trafficking victimization that could be used in a general sample. And we would go through the same sort of process of very carefully selecting those behaviorally specific items and validating the instrument. And that could be used among college students as well.
Yeah, so for the students, I put in the chat box here a link to Dr. Kulig's webpage, and you can see some of the work that she's been working on as well. So very, very important stuff to check out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Trey has a question here. And he says, I know you said you and Professor Graham's research centers around teenagers, young men often. How do you account for children in the environment they were raised in terms of social media and cell phones, and the positive and negative effects on them? And then maybe like, have you looked at anything about teaching children the right things, right, that you can do on social media, and what's okay and what's not okay?
Yeah, so the intimate partner cyber abuse research has centered on adults. The data we collected was only with adults. But my other research with Dr. Bonnie Fisher, who's at Cincinnati, we have done some work looking at data from teenagers. So that data also, I'm not sure about the effect of the environment someone is raised in, like the parenting style or the way they're socialized by their parents. But there's definitely a lot of research on how like a person's immediate environment in different situations can create risk. Like, alcohol, being in places where people are binge drinking is associated with higher risk for victimization. That's an area that we haven't quite delved into with the cyber stuff as much, but I think it's an interesting point that they raised there, the positives and negatives of social media for teenagers. On one hand, it provides all these opportunities to connect, to express yourself, to communicate with your friends, your family. On the other hand, it can create problems with body image and bullying and grooming for sexual abuse, all of these other problems that can emerge on social media. So I think that the programs that try to teach kids how to avoid abuse by managing their risky behaviors, or reducing the harm that they're at risk for when they engage in certain behaviors, I don't know that those have completely adapted to the new online environment yet. I think that that is an important new direction for those programs, like bystander intervention programs with adolescents today. I think probably are currently trying to start addressing cyber victimization and cyberbullying more and more, because it's become a more salient problem for kids.
All right. Are there any other questions from students? Again, feel free to put it in the chat box or unmute yourself if you want to ask. But I'm cognizant of our time winding down here. And it sounds like your research agenda moving forward, again, you are going to continue to work on this problem of cyber violence, it sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. The cyber victimization will be probably one of my main research areas moving forward. I just find it so interesting, and hopefully you all will see our article on social construction coming out soon. Yeah. But it's really fascinating the things that people say about these behaviors. We ask people like, should partners have to share their passwords with one another? And a lot of people say no, a person should have a right to privacy. But a lot of people say yes. A lot of people say, if you don't let your partner read your online messages, you must not trust them, or you must be hiding something, you must be cheating on them. If you don't let your partner track your whereabouts with GPS, you must be hiding something. So it's kind of fascinating and disturbing to see how people not only excuse these behaviors, like not only turn a blind eye, but actually might say partners should engage in these behaviors that we have identified as components of abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know some of our students, maybe even in this class, we offer some cybercrime classes here. We have a cyber certificate. So, I mean, this is an area I think that's growing, and certainly in academia, but there's a lot more research coming out. So if anyone is interested in any kind of cyber victimization or cyber crime kind of writ large, definitely make sure you keep up with Dr. Butler's research coming out, and Dr. Fissel as well. I know you guys have worked together in the past. I assume you're probably going to work together in the future on these issues. And it's just going to become more and more important as we move a lot of our lives online, right? This is our social media, where we get our news, where we do our banking. And in this class, family violence class, we'll talk a little bit more about the elderly too, in terms of power of attorney, and how there's been a lot of abuse, especially financial abuse of older individuals what's really kind of sad is when they turn a lot of that over to their children or their grandchildren, and they often are the abusers and the perpetrators of some of these crimes. And that could be their grandparents or their mothers and fathers. So
absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again so much for joining us today and talking about your research. It's really helpful. And again, students look on Folio for more helpful resources in this area as well.
Thank you so much for having me. Anyone, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to talk with you more and hear your ideas.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.